It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I've met some of you before, some of you I'm meeting for the first time, but I really wanted to thank Mannkal for having me here. I always love coming back to Mannkal because it's an environment where you can actually talk about ideas. And one of the things I'm really keen to do today with you, I had a whole speech prepared. I'm going a little bit rogue and have decided I'm just pushing it to one side. We've got some slides that we'll talk through, but what I'm really keen to do is actually hear your questions to have a bit of a conversation about human rights, because one of the things that surprises me a lot about the way we think about human rights in Australia is it tends to be a conversation stopper rather than a conversation starter. So we use human rights as a bit of a mic drop moment where if you're in a policy discussion with someone, you say, but my human rights, mic drop, it's the end of the conversation. Rather than actually engaging in a discussion about, well, what do human rights mean? What are they? Where do they come from? How do we deal with these things? And in my view, the discussion about human rights and what we mean by that is actually absolutely critical when you're talking about a discussion about how to create a prosperous, stable, forward-looking society. And it's also a discussion about which we often think there's only ever one answer. And, in my mind, there are some absolutes when it comes to human rights. But a lot of the time, there are areas where good people can actually disagree about what rights we value, where we draw the line, how we find the balance, how they should be applied in practice. So it's an area that's really ripe to have people who are interested in ideas and interested in creating, a better, stronger, more cohesive, freer Australia, actually really thinking about some of these issues. So what I thought I'd do to start with is just ask the question, what are human rights? And I love the quote from Mandela, which talks about, denying people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. This idea that human rights are something that are just so integral to who we are as a human being. But then again, there are different perspectives. And I also find really interesting as a conversation starter, the Jeremy Bentham quote, which is in essence, and I won't read the whole thing, but human rights are nonsense upon stilts. And the point he was trying to make here is really that you can just claim something's a human right, but it doesn't mean that it is. So how do we get to the essence of what human rights actually are and what they actually mean? And so I thought it would be really useful to start by throwing up some questions. And I'm sure you're hoping I would have come here today and just said, right, let's talk human rights. Here are the answers. Off you go. Unfortunately, that's not how it works when it comes to human rights. And my guess is you'll walk out of today, and probably I'll walk out of today with even more questions than we walked in with. And I think that's actually a really good thing, because if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's that when it comes to human rights, we're never going to reach the end of the road. We're never going to reach a point where we go, either in Australia or in the world, you know what, our job's done. Human rights are fine. They're protected. We don't need to worry about them anymore. The fact is we always need to be thinking about how are our rights and freedoms protected? What are our rights and freedoms? How do we balance them out against one another? How to create conditions where rights and freedoms can flourish? And it's not a conversation that will ever end. And from a country perspective, again, it's not a conversation that can ever stop, because we always need to be thinking about, even if we're the very best country in the world for human rights, which, by the way, I don't think we are, even if we were, everyone can be better when it comes to human rights. We can always think about different ways of doing things, better ways of doing things, and ways of advancing and protecting rights and freedoms. And again, I'll come to the end and leave you with a quote from Ronald Reagan, which is one of my favourites, that talks about freedom only ever being a generation away from extinction. So this is something we always need to be thinking about strengthening and protecting. As I quickly run down this list, please feel free to jump in if you've got questions along the way, because the risk is, Nathan mentioned I've got an academic background. The risk of that is I'll just talk forever. So please jump in if you do have anything you want to ask or say. But the first question is, well, where do these come from? And, it's tempting in the modern age to point to statutes, to point to the United Nations, to point to treaties. But is that where the rights actually come from? Or is that kind of their legal manifestation? Because what might be the risk of having your right, or thinking that your rights come from a UN treaty or a government dictate?
They can be taken away by the same entity.
Exactly. If your rights only exist because a UN piece of paper says that they do, what happens if that paper's taken away? If your rights only exist because a government grants them to you, well, doesn't that mean the government can take them away as well? So if we think that human rights are something inherent to us, they have to come from something other than a man-made body. So where do they come from? And it's a really hard question because, again, there are a lot of people who then fall back on saying, well, they come from a higher being. You know, they're inherent in us because we're human beings. But does that mean if you don't have faith, you can't believe in human rights? Or if you don't have the right faith? That can't be the case, surely. You know, if we accept that human rights include things like the right to religious freedom, and if we accept that human rights apply to everybody, no matter their values or views or beliefs, they can't come from one entity that not everybody believes in. So they have to stem from somewhere else. I don't have a perfect answer to that other than to say my view is that human rights are inherent in every human, that they're not dependent on somebody giving them to you. They're not dependent on what your particular beliefs are. They actually are there by virtue of the fact that there is something about being a human being. And the basis of them is that idea that every single human being is equal in value because of the fact that they're human. And from that, everything else follows. But then who decides what those rights are? Because again, it's really easy when we're talking about human rights, like everyone has a right to life. Though again, there are complexities in how you apply that, but as a basic principle. But, you know, I was talking before with Kate and Nicola about my kids who are 11 and 8. And since taking on this role, their favourite refrain for anything I try to get them to do is, but mum, my human rights. And, you know, as much as, you know, the right to life is enshrined in all sorts of documents, I don't think the right to a later bedtime is really a human right you can rely on. But how do you draw those distinctions? So when we're thinking about rights, we actually do need to think about what distinguishes a right from something that's just desirable or something that we want. Because there can be a lot of things that we think are good or positive or things we should aim for, but they're not rights. And one of the things that has become commonplace today is to use the language of rights in a way that, to my mind, actually diminishes the importance of the category. And I love, you know, everything in life you can get from a Disney movie or a Pixar movie or, you know, animation. In The Incredibles, you know, there's that phrase from Syndrome where he says, and when everyone's super, no one will be. I think the same thing applies to human rights. When everything is couched in the language of human rights, what meaning does it have? You know, rights are something different. And so we need to think quite clearly about what that means and what it is that we're saying is a right. And that's becoming more and more important because rights have grown at an exponential rate over the last 75 years. I don't say that's a bad thing. I think actually that's a good thing, but you need to be quite clear-headed about how you're distinguishing between what a human right actually is and what consequences that has. So then who's responsible for protecting them? Again, when sort of the modern age of human rights began, which was really following the creation of the United Nations, 75 years ago, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is where we kind of trace the beginning of the modern age of human rights. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion about rights and freedoms and a lot of things happened before that point. But in terms of the modern age of human rights, the starting point was really that rights are about regulating the relationship between the individual and government. So a lot of rights were couched in terms of the government shall not take away your right to this. They shall not pass laws that take away your right to that. Things have started shifting now so that we're talking about not only the rights or the role that government plays, but the role business plays in protecting human rights. And how far does that extend? But then also, does protecting human rights simply become a job of government? Or is it something that actually governs our relationships with each other? And as individuals, do we have a responsibility to protect other people's rights? And I think that's something that's really important to think about because, again, it changes your then conception of how you put human rights into practice in that are they only something where there's legislation in terms of the public sphere, or is it something that also needs to govern private behaviour, and how far do you extend that? Do rights come with responsibilities? We're very quick to talk about rights. We're not so quick these days to talk about what that means in terms of responsibility. And, you know, I'm sure there'll be questions that come up about, the pandemic and human rights and how that all unfolded. But I think that really does highlight this question, because we talk on the one hand about individual rights during the pandemic and limits that were placed on individual rights. How do you balance that out against broader rights to community health and safety and protecting other people? And so thinking about that balance is really important. And again, something where all of you in this room will probably have slightly different ideas about where that balance shall lie or should lie. And then the critical one is, how do you deal with conflicting human rights? You know, it is really easy to say you believe in human rights. Absolutely. If I ask now, do you all believe in human rights? I'm hoping you would all just put your hands up, right? And so if I said to you, do you believe in freedom of speech? I'm hoping you'd all put your hand up. I've got one person who's put their hand up. Everybody believes, put your hand if you believe in freedom of speech, right? Okay, next question. Do you believe in the freedom from racial discrimination, from racism? There's a right to be free from experiencing racism. Yeah, everyone puts their hand up, right? Just in a general high-level sense. Really easy to say, I believe in freedom of speech. I also think racism is a bad thing. Very few people would disagree with that. I would hope nobody. That's easy. How do you join those two things together? That's when the rubber hits the road, and that's when human rights becomes really important and really critical and has a real impact on people's lives. Because if I believe in freedom of speech, does that mean I have the right to say racist things? If I believe in freedom from racism, does that mean I shouldn't allow people to think things that might be heading down that path? And where do you draw the line? Because your version of what is completely offensive and absolutely inappropriate might be entirely different to mine. So these questions are really challenging, difficult questions, but critically important in terms of creating a society where we can all live with the maximum amount of freedom possible. And then, it leads straight to the next one. If the conflict between human rights or balancing rights is when things really get important and critical, well, who gets to decide where that balance lies? And so if you look again at something like the pandemic, who gets to decide when restrictions on rights are necessary? And who gets to decide how far those restrictions go? And who gets to decide in what circumstances a particular right can or can't be restricted? These are all really, really important questions. And then you get to some more questions around the concept of rights and what we mean. So a lot of our rights language is couched in terms of equality. But when we're talking about equality, do we mean equality or equity? Are we talking about people should have an equality of equal opportunity? Or are we talking equal outcomes? And they might seem like, just a little play on words. They're questions that have fundamental importance when it comes to outcomes. And whole world wars have been fought over really the difference between those two approaches. So when we talk of human rights, again, the modern era of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is really couched in terms of individual rights. But then as you read through, there's also mention of groups. And in this day and age where sort of identity politics really has come to the fore, when we're talking human rights, are we talking about a focus on the individual? Or are we defining an individual by the groups that they belong to? And again, that's really, really critical, because the impact that your decisions about restricting rights or taking rights away or granting rights will have will be radically different, depending on whether you're approaching rights from an individual perspective or you place greater emphasis on group rights. And I should also say that in all of these questions, I don't think there is one perfect answer that applies to all circumstances at all times. I think there are times when group rights are really important. I also think there are times when you can take that to an extreme and undermine individual rights as a result. So it's a matter really of thinking through all of the different circumstances and what the appropriate sort of response might be in a particular context. And then finally, how does the concept of individual choice fit with the idea of human rights? And this boils down to the idea that if your starting point for human rights is that human rights are about individuals being in charge of their own destiny and individuals being able to make their own choices and individuals having freedom, you have to accept that they may make choices you don't like. And they may choose to do things that you fundamentally disagree with. And is that something that we're willing to accept? And to what extent are we willing to accept that? So I think that's one of the really interesting questions increasingly about human rights, that you can't just view it through the lens of, if we apply human rights, we get this outcome, because human beings are different. And if we accept that diversity is a good thing, which I think it is, well, you have to accept that diversity of choice is important as well. And human beings will make different decisions about the things that they value and they see as being important. And these are questions that play out in a whole range of different ways, whether you look at, for example, the pandemic, where individual choice might be different people having different views towards risk and the risk that they're prepared to assume in terms of going out in public or wearing masks or taking vaccinations. Or it may come down to something like anti-discrimination laws, where we say, well, on the one hand, we have a freedom of association, and yet on the other hand, we're saying we have to be entirely equal in the way we treat everybody. How do those things fit together? And how do individuals who make different choices get accommodated within that framework? So there are a whole lot of questions that raise some issues around human rights that in my day-to-day work we grapple with in very different ways. Did anybody have any queries before I just move on to, I just want to run through the next bit, sort of the technical, let's give a quick snapshot of where rights are in Australia at the moment.
You've covered it to some degree, but the question of majorities.
Yeah.
Because if you look at individuals as an aggregate, so they're not acting as a group identity as such, but then you've got groups fighting each other. So what is the role of majoritarianism?
Well, and again, I don't think there's one perfect answer, because there is part of me that says, in a democracy, at the end of the day, the majority has to win out. At the end of the day, you're looking for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And to keep society running, you need to have some acceptance of, we have elections, the majority decision out of those elections is what ends up being enacted. But then at the same time, we've recognised, for example, in the Australian electoral system, you need to have protections in place to ensure that different minority groups are able to be accommodated and are able to have their interests served. So I think a complex society recognises there's a role for both, that you've got to have a way of having majority buy-in so that, the population as a whole can remain stable and everybody feels as though there is a clear path forward, but there has to be enough buy-in so that different groups don't feel as though they're completely shut out of the process. Tyranny by minority, absolutely. Absolutely. And we navigate those things every day in ways that we don't even really think about. But yeah, I don't think there's an answer on either extreme that's exactly right. And it's interesting because it's seen, as you look through all of the different human rights instruments, you see it in the structure of the United Nations. You have the General Assembly, which is very much a majority rules, but then the Security Council, where that's not the case. And in some circumstances, you can see why that's incredibly important. In other circumstances, you look at the fact, for example, that, Russia has taken on the presidency of the Security Council at this point in time, and it seems somewhat absurd, worse than absurd. But so I think that sort of tension is a really, really interesting one. What I wanted to just flag for you, and this is something that I think is critical, it's so easy to be overwhelmed when you start thinking about human rights. Where do we start? What are we talking about? It's a huge amount of material to grapple with when you actually start looking at the sheer number of international treaties, declarations, laws, pronouncements, etc. But really, to me, it just boils down to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a great starting point. I don't think that's where our human rights come from, but it is a very good enunciation of some of the key principles that people agreed to. And what's really interesting, if you look at the history of it, which is fascinating. So Eleanor Roosevelt is there. She's given some great speeches about the compromises that went into that declaration and how she was trying to balance Western conceptions of human rights with what were at the time sort of communist conceptions of human rights, and how you would work those things into one document that everybody could agree to. But I think the preamble in Article 1, there's a lot more to human rights, but this really captures the essence of it to me. So the preamble, the idea that inherent dignity, that every human being has inherent dignity by virtue of the fact that they're human, and equal and inalienable rights. Again, that concept of equality that is really critical to any understanding of human rights. And again, that's repeated in Article 1. The other bit that I like about Article 1, though, that is often ignored in terms of sort of legal obligation is this idea they're endowed with reason and conscience, which suggests to me the idea of human rights isn't just a descent into anarchy and doing whatever you want. It really highlights to me this idea that human rights come with responsibility, and that human rights aren't just about unthinkingly doing whatever makes you feel good. It's actually about thinking about a spirit of brotherhood and thinking about humanity in a broader sense, and managing to think about what you as an individual want in terms of controlling your own destiny, but also how that will impact other people. And how at the end of the day, there does need to be that spirit of reason, conscience, and brotherhood. And I use brotherhood in the appropriate gender neutral sense that it's meant to be used, to really show that human rights isn't just about you thinking in a really selfish way. To me, human rights is actually a very unselfish concept, because if I think that I'm deserving of human rights, I inevitably have to believe that you're deserving of human rights too. And the minute I have that understanding, it straight away starts to ameliorate my ability to just do whatever I want and start thinking about self-control and discipline and how my actions impact yours or your rights. But then if we look at how human rights are practiced, I suppose, in Australia, there are really some key levels. And I'm not going to go through this in a huge level of detail. I just want to flag it with you so you get a basic idea of the structure. A lot of you will know this already. The starting point in terms of modern human rights is really the international human rights framework. And we could have a long discussion about this, but I wanted to give you a sense of just how many different instruments there are. These are only the key, what we consider the core human rights instruments that Australia's ratified. We've ratified the vast majority. There are 2 or 3 that we haven't. But as you can see, they cover a huge suite of topics and areas, and there are a significant number of them. Each of these contain particular legal obligations for Australia. Many of these contain complaint mechanisms. So if you look, for example, at the optional protocols, they tend to be the ones that create mechanisms whereby people can go to the United Nations to seek recourse if their rights are violated. And they all contain different things that countries who sign up to them agree to do. Then at the domestic level, we have the Australian Constitution. The first thing to note is it's not a Bill of Rights. And this is the moment where I make a really controversial statement. I think that's a good thing. There tends to be this prevailing view at the moment that your constitution has to be a Bill of Rights. That's the only way you can protect rights. In actual fact, the very best bills of rights in the world come from the very worst countries. If you look, for example, at Chinese constitution, it has a fantastic provision about freedom of religion. Absolutely pitch perfect in terms of the technical drafting. If you have a look at Iran, their constitution talks a lot about the right to protest, which I would imagine the protesters in Iran aren't feeling greatly protected by at the moment. If you have a look at North Korea, they have a right to relaxation, constitutionally protected, which is fantastic. So I think bills of rights are really, they can be very, very important in terms of setting out what a country believes its obligations around human rights are and giving citizens an understanding of the language of human rights within that country. But a Bill of Rights at the end of the day is meaningless unless the government's prepared to abide by it and unless the citizens are invested in it. And so you need more than just words on a piece of paper, as important as words might be. In Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights, and that's not because our founding fathers just forgot about it. They actually had a really lengthy conversation over many, many years when they were drafting the Constitution about the best way to protect rights and freedoms. And their view was it was better to have a robust parliamentary Westminster system than to have Bill of Rights. And that's how you best protect human rights in their view. In my view, the Australian Constitution has proven one of the most enduring and successful in the history of mankind. And so I think if we're looking at better protecting human rights, strengthening parliamentary democracy and strengthening those institutions that the founding fathers thought were the best to protect human rights is probably a really good first step, rather than going straight to a Bill of Rights. The second thing to note is the Commonwealth has certain legislative powers set out under Section 51 of the Constitution. there's no human rights power. So if the government wants to enact human rights laws, they need to do it under other heads of constitutional power, which is really easy to do because at the end of the day, you go straight to external affairs and you saw the long list of international treaties. So it's very easy to overcome the lack of a specific human rights power. The other thing to note is there are some specific individual rights, very limited, but there are some. There's a freedom of religion clause, for example, that's been interpreted in a very narrow technical way so that it's not freedom of religion in the fulsome way you would use in ordinary language, but rather a more technical provision. And there are also implied constitutional limitations. So this is where the High Court has read into the Constitution certain human rights that it says has to be there by virtue of the structure of the document. And the implied freedom of political communication is one example of that. And again, we could have a very long discussion about reading implications into the Australian Constitution. I would get very excited about that, but I imagine some of you might not be as thrilled with that as I would be. In Australia, in addition, the Constitution is sort of there as a starting point, but the majority of human rights protections come through statute. So at the Commonwealth level, it's particularly anti-discrimination laws. So we have a Sex Discrimination Act, Age Discrimination Act, etc., etc. And at the state and territory level, there are also a wide range of legislative provisions that are human rights protective. In particular, if you look at ACT, Victoria and Queensland, there are human rights charters in a number of jurisdictions that are effectively statutory bills of rights. There's the common law in Australia, and I've got a quote from Robert French up there that talks about how the common law is used to really try to minimise intrusions into rights and freedoms. And then finally, there's statutory interpretation, and there's a principle of legality that effectively, and I'm paraphrasing, but effectively says that when judges are interpreting legislation, they should assume that Parliament wanted to protect rights and freedoms unless there are clear indications otherwise. So all of this means that while there's a patchwork approach really to protecting rights and freedoms in Australia, because we don't have that comprehensive Charter of Rights, there is protection in a variety of means through both your international frameworks, the national legislation, the common law and statutory interpretation. The other thing that I think is really important when you're thinking about the protection of human rights in Australia is to think about your starting point. Because when it comes to law in Australia, our starting point is that you are able to do anything you want to do unless the law tells you you can't. If you put that into a human rights context, that means you have full freedom, except insofar as the law restricts it. And I actually think that's important to reflect on, because what it means is our starting point is freedom is maximised, except and until the law restricts it. To my mind, a charter actually reverses that, because a charter says your freedom is this, and we'll take it from there. It's a very different starting point in terms of how you look at human rights and freedoms. Yeah.
Lorraine, do you think that, given that starting point, and I mean, going to court is one way of a more formal discussion, which one would hope ordinarily would happen without having to go to court to some sort of resolution. But is a common law outcome better than a statutory law outcome? In other words, a legal precedent.
Yeah.
Have an impact, and I know sometimes that's transformed into a statutory
Yeah.
law, but which do you feel is better?
Again, I don't think there's an absolute answer. The thing that I love about the common law is it allows for that gradual evolution. So you're able to develop over time rather than statute can sometimes be quite jarring. And there's less chance than in the common law of unintended consequences. The flip side of that is it can be a much slower way of correcting things that haven't worked as planned. So yeah, I am a big fan of the common law system, but equally I've had some really amazing discussions with counterparts, for example, in Europe, who think that the common law is absolute rubbish and are a big fan of the civil law system. So
Isn't one of the inherent issues or problems or challenges going to statutory level legislation?
well, I think that's a challenge everywhere in varying degrees. And, you know, it's an important thing because at the end of the day, we kind of have this idea in the modern era that everything should be objective and independent and be removed from politics. In actual fact, human rights inherently, and I'm not suggesting politicizing in the sense of partisan politics, but human rights inherently, these are issues that matter to people. These have a direct impact on you. These are issues that go to your conscience and go to your very soul. And to that end, they're not the sort of issues, to my mind, that judges are best placed to make decisions about. Because when we're talking about how do you balance different human rights, you're effectively making decisions about social and political and moral issues. You're not just interpreting legal words in a statute. And you're having to make decisions that are subjective in nature. So for that, I think a democratic input is a really important thing to have. And something that, we often do lose sight of, the importance when you have an issue where there isn't a clear-cut, perfect answer, the best way to get a result that is acceptable to people is to have democratic input into it. Because then even if I disagree with the result, I can understand the process that went into it and accept that I had an opportunity to be part of that discussion. So I've got up here some mechanisms for protection. Again, I won't go into these in detail other than note that there are at the international level a lot of different complaints mechanisms that can be used. Some of these are really effective and really important to have. But I'd also make the point that, and I've got a link up there to a chapter that I wrote in the WA Law Handbook that sort of sets out how to make complaints to the United Nations and the different mechanisms you can use. The process is amazingly simple and really easy to access. There's literally, for most of the mechanisms, a website that you go to, you click on the complaints button, it's got a form, you fill it out and off it goes. The challenge with that is that the people who most need to have that protection are the least able to access that support. Because if you're a young girl in Afghanistan who's been shut off from the world and isn't allowed to access education, you don't have a computer that you can go to click on a form, and you can't then travel to Geneva to lobby the United Nations. So these mechanisms are important, but they're not adequate. The other thing that we have in Australia is a variety of domestic mechanisms. So there's the access to court through various judicial mechanisms. There are legislative mechanisms, so the opportunity to engage in the democratic process, to work through parliamentary committees, to lobby parliamentarians for change. And there are also executive agencies with human rights responsibilities. There are a whole range in Australia, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, which I'm part of. And I'm more than happy if anybody does have questions to talk a little bit more about those roles and responsibilities and the different things that we do. But what I did just want to leave you with is, why does this matter and why is it important? And, I actually think it's more important than ever that we're having discussions about human rights and why they matter and what we can do to better protect them. The reason for that is we've really lost sight of how extraordinary the period of history we're in is. The fact that 75 years ago, countries actually came together and decided to express human rights and to agree, even if they haven't in practice always done it, but agree to limit government power to provide for individual rights and freedoms, that's never happened before at a global level. And so even though the world today is incredibly imperfect, these last 75 years have been unparalleled in terms of the priority that's been given to trying to advance human rights and human freedom. And yet we're at a point today where, the geopolitical circumstances are increasingly complex. And I think we need to understand in Australia that not every country in the world shares our conception of what human rights are and whether they're important. And you're seeing around the world a real backsliding, I think, in terms of both human rights, but also in terms of democracy, and an understanding of how important democracy is in terms of maximising the opportunity to protect human rights and protect human freedom. And, the quote from Ronald Reagan, it's an old quote now, but it really does encapsulate it. The fact is, this isn't something that you can ever take for granted. And, we saw during the COVID pandemic just how quickly these rights can suddenly disappear, whether for good reason or not, but how fragile these things actually are. And again, we saw from how quickly, within a matter of days, WA entered into a state of emergency, and yet it took 3 years before that was released. So these things are very easy to lose and very hard to regain. And that's why I think, excuse me, it's so critical that we're constantly thinking about human rights, talking about human rights, and reminding ourselves of how important it is to actually create a society where these things are valued and where we understand what their value is. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've talked for way too long, but very happy to take any questions that you might have. Straight away. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Finlay.
Oh, please, Lorraine.
My apologies. My question is about the way that people value human rights, and in particular,
Excuse me.
I feel that maybe perhaps people haven't valued human rights as strongly in recent times because they've lacked an existential threat to their way of life. More specifically, they have lacked perspective in terms of they don't know what a society without the same rights that we enjoy looks like. So ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, people have lacked that existential other, until quite recently with China becoming more in the forefront. People see what that looks like. Do you think, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, excuse me for the coughing. I apologise. It's literally just caught my breath wrong. I agree in the sense that certainly not all Australians, so I don't want to generalise in that sense, because I fully am very aware and fully understand there are some Australians who find themselves in situations of extreme disadvantage and where their human rights aren't taken for granted. But I think for the vast majority of Australians, up until quite recently, it was very easy to go through your day-to-day life not having to think about human rights. Because pretty much, you can argue around the edges, but pretty much the government protected the things that were really important. And there weren't those serious incursions into fundamental human rights in the same way as perhaps was the experience in other countries. What I do think the pandemic did, which is quite interesting, and you talked about the existential threat from some other, big powers and changing geopolitical circumstances. I actually think a more immediate thing has been during the pandemic, people got a first-hand understanding of what it means to have freedom of movement. That's not something that I'd really ever had to worry about before. But now when I'm not allowed to leave my house, I've got a very tangible example of why human rights are important and what I need to think about. So I do think there's a really important opportunity to reflect on the last few years. And again, we'd probably all have differing views about what was done right, what was done wrong, where the balance should lie. But I think reflecting on that is actually really important. And it's a really critical time for us to be having a conversation in this country about what can we learn from that and what does it say to us about why rights are important. I also think at that global scale, it is exactly that. I think Ukraine and the events in Ukraine have really reminded the world that some of the assumptions we've made about the state of the world and things that could and couldn't be done in terms of invading other countries and respecting sovereign borders and those types of things, I think some of those assumptions have shifted. And seeing the way that these discussions are now turning in terms of talking about freedom and the importance of rights and the importance of standing up for these values, that's why, to my mind, and again, I know there are different views around this, but in my mind, why what's happening over in Ukraine actually has an importance to Australia beyond that country itself. I actually think it's a broader issue in terms of where we stand in the world in terms of rights and freedoms.
So many questions. The next thing is, you mentioned earlier about China, countries like China and North Korea having very clear standards for what they consider human rights. But do you think that that rigidity also serves to constrict human rights? So, for example, in China, with the protection for the right to protest, I believe it says that citizens have the right to protest as long as it's not illegal. But of course, who decides what is and isn't illegal? And so do you feel, therefore, that when legislating rights, that a degree of ambiguity is necessary in order to ensure that those rights are protected?
Well, I do. And yet the other extreme of that, if there's so much ambiguity that it becomes meaningless, well, what's the point of having them in the first place? So again, it's one of those interesting questions where I think if you end up at either extreme, you're not in the best of places. And you can see that, in Australia. Oh, well, actually, in international treaties are probably a better example. The wording of these treaties is often incredibly broad, precisely because you want to get the greatest number of countries signing onto the treaties as you can. The end result is you might end up with a treaty that doesn't actually contain the specific obligations you really need it to contain. The flip side of that is you have a treaty that is too specific and too constrained in the language that it uses. It can't adapt with circumstances, it can't develop over time, and it doesn't really allow you to build in the way that you probably need to. So yeah, again, there's no single answer to it, but I think it's right at both ends. Yeah.
Considering like Australia obviously has very strong ties with countries like China for trade,
Mm-hmm.
how do we like negotiate balancing like human rights and obviously economic contribution and all those kinds of things? Like how do we decide what we place first and foremost compared to the economy or human rights and that kind of negotiation?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, and I wish I had a really simple answer for you, and I don't think there is one. I think it's a constant tension in terms of recognising first and foremost that economic prosperity allows for human rights. So, to my mind, if Australia is strong economically, and if Australia is moving forward economically and developing economically, we have a much better opportunity to advance and protect human rights. The flip side of that is I don't think you can rely on the assumption that was probably made really in the 1980s and 90s that if you have greater trade, that will inherently lead to greater openness and improvement in terms of human rights. That's worked in some places to some degree, but it definitely hasn't in others. So I think that's actually a really fundamental challenge. And, again, really interesting in terms of what it says about the world and our commitment to human rights, because I look at things like what's happened only recently with the United Nations report into, for example, the Xinjiang province, where they didn't use the language of genocide, but they did find credible evidence that there was crimes against humanity being committed there. The world said never again, decades and decades and decades ago, and yet we're living through an age where there's strong evidence that's happening. How you balance those things is really difficult, and I don't have a perfect answer. I wish I did, other than saying I think Australia is right to continue to maintain economic development and look for economic engagement, but I also think we have to stand firm on our values.
Hi Lorraine, great talk by the way, it's really really good. Just out of curiosity, so you mentioned the whole sort of tug of war in a way between individualism and collectivist rights versus responsibilities, and how sometimes it's a bit of a grey area and can be quite contentious. And you also mentioned the Australian Constitution, and I'm going to be the guy to ask the question. Just out of curiosity, whether it's your personal thoughts or a technical analysis, what is your thoughts on the voice to Parliament?
So, look, I think it's a really important debate. And can I just say, I think the number one most important thing in relation to this over the next few months, we have to, as a country, be able to have a civil, respectful discussion about an issue that is critically important. And what's actually really worried me, certainly in terms of my own personal experience since my op-ed came out, but what I've seen over the last few weeks on a whole number of fronts, and I have to say, I don't think either, I hate using the idea of sides in the debate, but if you bear with me for a moment, I don't think either side comes to this with clean hands. And I think you can see examples on both sides of people attacking the person, not the idea, and people really delving into a level of debate that is not helpful in a democracy. And, I've got to admit, I've had a number of people say in relation to my op-ed, it was brave to write. Can I say we're in a really disturbing position in Australia if a human rights commissioner making comments about human rights issues is a brave thing to do. I find that extraordinary. And I also should say from the beginning, I understand my view is not the majority of the commissions. There are people who have different views, and I understand their views, I respect their views. My view is also not the majority amongst human rights commissioners. So straight after my op-ed was published, there were 5 of my people who formerly occupied my role who expressed very strong disagreement with my views. And again, I respect them enormously, and I think they have a good contribution to make, and I read their views with great interest. My personal view is that if we talk at a larger level about human rights, I think we need to think about how we balance out group rights with individual rights. And what I think is really important in relation to the voice to Parliament is to think about how the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, which has really been brought out in a lot of the arguments as being the basis for the idea of the voice and everything that will follow. We need to think about how UNDRIP sits under that broader umbrella of the Universal Declaration, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and how the idea of a group right that's entrenched in the Constitution in a permanent way sits with rights to equality. And I'm not sure that's been fully explained to me. So again, my own view, and I think it's uncontroversial to say, of course, every Australian should have a say in the decisions that affect them. That's part of being a democracy. That's absolutely. And of course, in my view, the level of disadvantage that so many Indigenous Australians face is a national shame. But the fact is we have, for many, many years, been focused on trying to close the gap, and we haven't come close. And we need to do more. I think we need to separate out the broader argument about reconciliation, closing the gap, race relations in Australia from the argument out of voice, because they're different things. I also think we need to separate out the idea of the voice in a general sense from the specific model that's being put forward. Because what I said in my op-ed was, in addition to the general comments about human rights, when you look at this particular model, my concerns are twofold. The first is the fact that it extends not only to Parliament but to the executive. And I think that raises a number of questions that haven't been fully explored. So, for example, the Australian Human Rights Commission is an independent statutory agency. Are we a body that would then have to consider representations from the voice, and how would that work? Those sort of questions haven't been fully explored, despite the fact that we've been talking about this issue for a very, very long time. The second thing that I think really needs to be thought about is the policy areas that the voice would touch on. Because at the moment, the way the amendment is worded, the voice would touch on everything. Because every policy area is a policy area that affects Indigenous Australians, because they're Australians. If you're talking about a specific voice that looks at specific issues that have specific significance to Indigenous Australians, that's one thing. If you're talking about a general voice that affects every policy area, I think that's another. And I think the two need to be looked at in terms of what that would mean. So in terms of this model, I do have some concerns. Having said that, I'm interested in the views that people have on this, and in listening to the debate and actually having a genuine discussion about what's the right approach for Australia. And it worries me that we're not seemingly having that debate in a really constructive way at the moment.
In terms of, I suppose, work opportunities and jobs with the Australian Human Rights Commission, what sort of, can you expand on that a bit, outside of law stuff?
Yeah, so you don't have to be a lawyer to work at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Obviously, we do have lawyers there. But if I think about my team, so my team is myself and I've got 3 staff, and one of them is a lawyer. So there are certain roles that are specifically legal. There are certain roles, we have people at the Commission who are anthropologists, who are historians, who are people who've done general public policy degrees, child psychologists. There are a whole range of different backgrounds, which again, to my mind, is what you want at a Human Rights Commission. You want a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of backgrounds. We have people with lived experience versus people who have years of academic experience. There's a whole range, which I think is really positive. In terms of careers, we have a publicly advertised website that's got all of job opportunities come up. We also have an internship program where you can apply to work for particular teams within the Human Rights Commission, and that can be a really useful way of getting an understanding of the depth and breadth of work that we do. But I'd say if you're interested in human rights, there are such a huge variety of opportunities in Australia, both generally in terms of human rights, but also in terms of specific areas that people might have a passion for. And it's something I definitely encourage you to think about, not only as a career, but also just in terms of volunteering and community engagement. There are so many people in Australia who are doing amazing things to really try and strengthen and grow human rights in a variety of different ways.
You kind of briefly touched on it before in your answer to the voice question. But you mentioned well, in Australia we have the rise of, not just Australia but the Western world, the rise of kind of cancel culture, where people are cancelling out people not for their ideas, but just purely because of who they are or what they stand for. Do you see this as a danger to our human rights, and if so, how do you think we should protect ultimately a threat that's coming from individuals and society and not a government?
I think it's more than a danger to human rights. I think it's a danger to democracy. And what really concerns me about it, and can I preface this by saying I'm not suggesting that there should be responsibility for the things that you say. I think people should be held accountable for the statements that they make, but you attack the statement, not the person. You know, again, we have to engage in a discussion of ideas and be able to separate ideas from people. And I feel really old when I say it, because I'm talking about back in the days. But, you know, I distinctly remember being at university and having absolute brawls in tutorials with people about ideas that we fundamentally disagreed. And then you go down to the tavern, have a drink at the end of it, and have a really great discussion. You know, at the end of the day, we're at a point now where people are tending to not just say, I disagree with your idea, but I disagree with you, and because of that, you're an evil, bad person. That is a real problem, I think. Because the minute you do that, people start self-selecting out, and they don't start speaking out. They don't, want to go into certain things. They don't want to talk about certain topics. And, my view is even the most unassailable truth benefits from being challenged. It's always a good thing to be able to challenge ideas and talk about ideas. And I think being exposed to ideas that are wrong is as important as being exposed to ideas that are truthful and good. Because how do you learn the value of something if you don't understand what the alternatives are? How do you learn what truth is if you're not exposed to falsehood? And so one of the things I think that's really pernicious about cancel culture is it actually diminishes the whole idea or the whole value that we place in ideas and discussion and open discourse. And I think that diminishes democracy more broadly. But added to that, I think we're going a step further, and we're not only attacking people now for things they themselves have said, but for things people they've associated with have said. And that's taking it even a step further. And it goes back to that sort of medieval idea that if my parent commits an offence, 7 generations of children will be punished for that. I thought we'd moved away from that a long time ago. But, it has gotten to the point now where if you're in a room with somebody, it's kind of assumed that, you therefore endorse everything they've ever done in their life. And if they've done anything slightly questionable, you're personally responsible for that. I think that's outrageous. So I'm worried about it, yes. I would say as well, though, one of the things that I think is really interesting is we have more information than ever before in the world. It's actually extraordinary the amount of information and opinions and ideas that are around us. We're actually less interested in ideas than I think ever before. And that's really concerning. This idea that we're only going to surround ourselves with things that make us feel safe or things that we agree with. I don't think you can grow as a person if that's all that you're ever going to do.
You mentioned quite a lot in your speech that a lot of human rights discussion today is rooted in multilateral institutions like the United Nations. I think in order for that to work, there has to be a certain degree of confidence in the UN as an institution. We've seen recently with Russia, a permanent UN Security Council member invading a sovereign country in a war of conquest, and we see another permanent member, China, threatening to invade Taiwan in the not too distant future. And that seemed, many people's confidence in the UN seems to have been shaken. And what implications do you think that has for human rights?
Yeah, I think it does have serious implications. And I should say, I think the UN is very easy to criticise. And I think there are some justified criticisms. I also think we sometimes lose sight of how important it is and the good that it does do. And, I say this as someone who is often critical of the United Nations, but at the end of the day, I prefer to have a world where it was there than a world where it wasn't. And my concern with that diminishing trust in institutions is that what you're seeing around the world is certain countries, certain people starting to withdraw from global institutions and becoming more isolationist. And I actually think that's damaging for human rights, and that worries me. So I see great value, not in Australia uncritically engaging in everything, but I see great value in Australia engaging with the United Nations. I actually think the answer to this isn't to withdraw. If we're concerned about the United Nations, the answer is to lean in and to actually be part of efforts to make it as great an institution as it can be. because there is some extraordinary work that the United Nations does. There's some really fantastic things that it's doing, but it also should be subject to accountability and scrutiny in the same way as every other institution. So I think it is worrying not only from the United Nations, but that erosion of trust in institutions more generally. I think it's really damaging because just like freedom, trust is something that's very hard to gain and very easy to lose, and it's damaging to society generally if we don't have the population being able to trust in core societal institutions that really create that society cohesion.
Lorraine, I'm a great believer in good governance, and to me, the key to good governance is the path, the outcome is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that trajectory to better human rights is the key here. And in Article 1, the last bit of that sentence to me is the real killer, because it embodies, I think, Adam Smith's sense, the classical liberal sense, that I can do what I like, but I have to be aware of what impact it has on others, and also take heed of that, not just hear it and keep doing what I want to do. And I see a strong parallel to what we see in economics too, because there's a certain philosophy in economics that thinks that the pie is only so big. But of course, the free market liberty approach to the economy is we grow the pie. So it seems to me that there are certain forces in the human rights venture that see it as a pie only so big, and in order for me to improve my rights, I have to take rights from somebody else. And that's not a synthesis, that's a war. And I think I go a little bit further than you. I think some of the behaviour I see and we see in public and on Twitter and YouTube videos is on the verge of what happened before the Second World War and before Rwanda. So if you vilify a group that you don't like to the point where you dehumanise them, then all sorts of really bad human behaviour is really unleashed.
Yeah, and it's again I think we're living in a time of paradox, right? Because get more information than ever before, less interest in ideas, more human connectivity than ever before, but less connection. It's so easy when you're engaging with people online not to see the person at the other end and not to think about the impact that what you're saying will have. And again, not to harp on about my personal examples, because the things that I receive are minuscule compared to so many other people. But they're things that people would never say to your face, and yet they somehow think that online that's acceptable behaviour, and it's just not. And so I think, but again, the flip side of that is you don't want to then come in and restrict speech in such an overwhelming way that you stop legitimate conversations from being able to happen. Because again, I love the famous Salman Rushdie quote, and I'm paraphrasing, that democracy is not a tea party. No, it's not about just sitting down and being polite to each other. You're dealing with controversial, challenging issues. There's going to be emotion and passion involved, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's finding a way of having the emotion and passion while recognising the humanity in the people that you're talking to and impacting. And I think that's something we've lost sight of. At the end of the day, for all of the international treaties I can point you to and technical human rights obligations and legal talk that we could have about what they mean in practice, the bottom line is human rights are about how we treat each other. It's about simply recognising the fact that you're as important as I am. And we share that common humanity, and that means we should be treating each other as we want to be treated. It really is that simple, but putting that into practice is much, much harder. Wow.
You were saying how it's like multiple human rights conflict, and I think that was just a prime example of it. What mechanisms would you say can be used to kind of come to this balance, whether they be private or public? Because obviously if it's a private actor, there are other people that are going to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
But do you think the public ever has a role in that?
I absolutely do. And the reason I think that is because when you have a situation where there are some human rights situations where there is just a clear-cut right and wrong. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that when there is a clear-cut direct harm being caused to somebody that you should say, well, that's a matter of compromise. There are times where there is right and there is wrong. There are also occasions, however, where there needs to be that balance struck. And you need to find ways of compromising and actually trying to find a way of navigating a situation so that we know what we're doing is affecting each other's rights, but we're going to try and do that in a way that preserves as much freedom for each of us as possible. The fact is, oftentimes in those outcomes, nobody gets exactly what they want. So the only way you get a solution that everybody can be happy with is if there's been a process that people have been able to play into and people have been able to feel as though they've been listened to and been heard. And that's where I think that democratic process is the best way to protect rights, because what it means is there might be an outcome that at the end of the day I'm not entirely happy with, but I know how that outcome's being reached. I know what different perspectives have gone into it, and I can live with that because I feel as though there's a way for me to have input. So that's why I think those democratic processes are so important, because they allow you to reach the compromises that you sometimes need to reach in a way that allows people who don't necessarily love the outcome to still feel as though they can live with it. But you also then do need those harder-nosed, more direct processes like the legal mechanisms to avoid the more egregious examples and to really prevent harms from occurring. So you need both.
I think we'll end the formal side of today here. You're more than welcome to stay for some general chit chat now if you wish. Please join me in thanking Lorraine.